I just got a countdown, so I'm always so excited when you guys enter the chat. So, good evening, everyone. I see people entering into the room. So, welcome for being with us this evening. Really excited for the conversation we're going to have tonight. It's a very serious, of course, conversation and timely, as with so much that's going on with the world right now. So, I'm just going to go ahead and get us started. Since we're starting a couple of minutes later to make sure we had everyone in place and make sure we had all of you at home or wherever you're at watching in location, so we can have this really good conversation. So before we even get started, I want to give a bit of a context. So my name is Tamara Brummer, and I'm the Senior Advisor for National Outreach and Engagement for Demand Justice. And I really want to thank you for joining us this evening for our SCOTUS Salon on the Supreme Court case of the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruen. And thank you to our incredible co-sponsors and partners, March for Our Lives and Guns Down America. So before we get started, I think it's always very helpful to kind of give a little bit of context to why we're here and why we're having this conversation this evening. So as many as you know, Republican politicians led by Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell have run a decades-long win-at-all-cost campaign to install a solid conservative majority on the Supreme Court. In order to achieve that goal, the Republican Party broke every norm and convention in the book. First, they blocked President Obama from appointing a justice for nearly a year. They lowered the threshold for confirmation of Supreme Court justices, sweeping under the rug credible allegations of sexual assault, and finally rushing to confirm President Trump's last nominee in the final days of the 2020 election after more than 60 million of us had already voted. As a result of the scorched earth approach to politics, the Supreme Court's majority is now wildly out of step with the people it serves, which is you and me. Their rulings almost exclusively are in favor of corporate and Republican Party interests at the expense of everyday Americans and our democracy. Just in the past 5 years, the court has drastically weakened the Voting Rights Act and shut the doors to lawsuits challenging extreme partisan gerrymandering, while narrowing the rights of workers to organize and strike down key components to campaign finance reform. And in the midst of a global pandemic, we've watched them strip away at the things that are keeping us safe and healthy. So as we saw during the November 3rd oral arguments in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruen, one of the areas in which the court's newly fortified conservative supermajority will have the greatest impact is in our ability to combat our country's worsening gun violence epidemic. 13 years ago, the Supreme Court radically expanded the scope of the Second Amendment, ruling for the first time that it guarantees an individual right to keep and bear arms. Now that Justices Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett are on the bench, the court appears ready to abandon what's left of our centuries-old understanding of the limits of the Second Amendment, making it all but impossible to meaningfully address our country's tragic reality of gun violence. It's clear that the Supreme Court poses an imminent threat to our ability to balance the right to own guns with the ability to save lives. And while we are still so excited that Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson will be joining the court later this year when Justice Breyer steps down, she alone will not be able to neutralize that threat. We have to do more, and we have to do it now. So this evening, we'll talk with gun violence prevention advocates about what this case means for the future of gun violence prevention and why, in order to protect ourselves, our future, and our democracy and our communities, we must add seats to the Supreme Court, full stop. But first, I'm really excited that we are joined by Congressman Mondaire Jones. Congressman Jones is a champion for so many of the progressive issues we care about, including gun violence prevention. He knows that Americans deserve to live without fear of violence in their communities and that gun violence is an epidemic, and it stands in the way of that goal. As vice chair of the House Judiciary Court Subcommittee, he also is one of the 3 original co-sponsors of the Judiciary Act of 2021, which would add 4 seats to the Supreme Court. And so we are so lucky to have him with us in this fight and to have us with us this evening. So welcome, Congressman Jones.
Well, good evening, everyone. And thank you so much, Tamara, for your very kind introduction. And of course, thank you to everyone at Demand Justice for your vital work to end gun violence, among other things. You are literally saving lives through this effort. As you all know well, too many lives are lost in America to the epidemic of gun violence, about 100 people every day. I was 11 years old when the Columbine school shooting happened. I was afraid then, but I never imagined that mass shootings in America would become the new normal. Yet that is exactly what has happened. Since Columbine, more than 292,000 children have experienced gun violence at school. There were more school shootings in 2021 than in any year since 1999, the year of Columbine. And already this year, there have been 113 mass shootings of all kinds. It is shameful that an entire generation of Americans has grown up in an era defined by gun violence. But thankfully, it does not have to be this way. We have the power to end gun violence. We only have to use it. That's exactly what my House colleagues and I have been doing on the Democratic side. I proudly voted for common sense legislation like the Bipartisan Background Checks Act, a long overdue bipartisan bill to require a background check for nearly every firearm sale. I was also proud to help pass the Enhanced Background Checks Act, which would close the so-called Charleston loophole. Today, when someone tries to buy a gun, the FBI has to finish its background check in 3 days, just 3 days. And if the FBI can't finish in time, the buyer gets the gun anyway, even if the background check would have found that person to be ineligible to purchase a firearm. That is how Dylan Roof was able to purchase the gun he used to kill 9 innocent people in the heinous massacre at the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. The Enhanced Background Checks Act would close that lethal loophole. As a member of the House Judiciary Committee, I also helped advance $2.5 billion in the House-passed version of Build Back Better for community violence intervention, evidence-based, community-driven strategies for reducing gun violence through social and economic assistance. The bills we passed in the House would save lives, but the Senate has not put any of them up for a vote. And in the decades since Columbine, the United States Supreme Court has made this epidemic even worse. The question is, why? And the answer is, the Republican Party has broken our democracy and it has captured the Supreme Court. For decades, the American people have cast their ballots for the candidates who promised to end gun violence. Democratic candidates for president won the popular vote in 7 of the last 8 presidential elections, but we had to endure 3 Republican presidential terms anyway. Republican senators represent 40 million fewer people than their Democratic colleagues, but hold the same 50 seats that Democratic senators do. The overwhelming public support for new federal gun violence prevention laws has not translated into real change because our democracy is broken. To end the scourge of gun violence, we need to build a democracy that actually works for everybody. And that starts with ending the filibuster, which has stood in the way of gun violence prevention measures for years. And that continues with passing the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act, which would end partisan gerrymandering, protect the right to vote, and amplify the power of ordinary Americans in our politics by reducing the corrosive, pernicious influence of big money in our politics. The other obstacle we need to overcome is the 6-3 far-right supermajority that controls the Supreme Court. 14 years ago, the court invented an individual right to own a gun in its ruling in a case called District of Columbia v. Heller. Their position is so indefensible that even former Chief Justice Warren Burger, a Nixon appointee, had denounced that position as one of the greatest pieces of fraud on the American public. That's a quote, one of the greatest pieces of fraud on the American public he had ever heard. And let's be very clear, the American people have paid the price this entire time. According to the Violence Policy Center, in the first 8 years after the Heller decision, the death rate from firearms rose 17%. That's thousands more needless deaths per year. Of course, we don't know for certain how many people were killed because of the Heller ruling itself, but we can be certain that in an era when mass shootings have traumatized a generation of children, the court's hostility to gun violence prevention is completely unacceptable. As I speak, the court's far-right supermajority is preparing to make our gun violence epidemic even worse. This term, the court is going to decide a case called New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruen, as you just heard. It's a case that threatens to create an unprecedented right to carry a concealed weapon in public. No doubt, the court will dismissively insist that unleashing more guns on our streets won't mean more gun violence. But too many people have lost their lives for us to fall for the court's lies. We can't continue to allow the Supreme Court to facilitate gun violence. That's one reason why last year I introduced the Judiciary Act of 2021 alongside Senator Ed Markey and Representatives Hank Johnson and Jerry Nadler. The bill is simple. It would restore balance to the Supreme Court by expanding it to 13 justices. By expanding the court, we can send the far-right supermajority to its rightful place in the minority and reverse the fraud that they have perpetrated on guns. We know that Republicans are fighting court expansion really hard. They mentioned it, in fact, in a hearing earlier today on something completely unrelated, on a hearing about ethics at the Supreme Court. That is how concerned they are that we might do the one thing that will prevent them from entrenching minority power in this country for generations. They know that when we expand the court, it will be nearly impossible for them to defy the overwhelming bipartisan support for common sense gun violence prevention in this country. So my message to you is that we have to work even harder. As you know, this work will not be easy. It never has been. But together, I promise you, we can do this to ensure that not one more child, parent, or sibling has to lose a loved one to the epidemic of gun violence. We must ensure that doesn't happen. Thank you so much. And I'll hand things back to you, Tamara.
Thank you again, Congressman Jones, for joining us this evening and for just connecting the dots for us. I think that oftentimes when these things are happening, we can talk about one case and that's the thing that we're focused on. But the reality is that all these things are connected, and how we protect our democracy and our communities and how we can show up for each other, and that we have a court that at the center of all of this that makes it harder and harder for us to do the things to make our country work for all of us. So thank you again for being our ally and our partner in this fight.
Thank you.
So I'm really, really excited to continue this conversation with two amazing guests that we have with us this evening. We have Matt Post, who is the Judicial Advocacy Associate at March for Our Lives. He's a former member of the Board of Education in Montgomery County, Maryland, soon to be graduate of Yale University, big ups, soon to be graduate, who is earning his bachelor's degree in ethics, politics, and economics. So thank you so much, Matt, for joining us. And then we also have Igor Volsky. Did I say it right, Igor? Because I practiced it. Okay, good. Igor Volsky, excuse me, the co-founder and executive director of Guns Down America, author of Guns Down, How to Defeat the NRA and Build a Safer Future with Fewer Guns, and previously served as the deputy director of the Center for American Progress Action Fund and as vice president at the Center for American Progress. So Igor and Matt, thank you so much for joining us. And for our folks who are watching, please feel free to drop some questions in the chat. Also, just tell us who you are and where you're from. We love to see who's joining us for the conversation this evening or this afternoon, wherever you're at. So I want to kick off the first question to Igor. Congressman Jones talked about this case briefly. It was District of Columbia versus Heller. And so in 2008, the Supreme Court departed from what had until that point been the common understanding of the scope of the Second Amendment. Can you tell us about this case and how it changed the Second Amendment landscape?
Yes, and thank you, Tamara. Thank you for organizing this event. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and for the congressman for his remarks. This was really a pivotal case, partly because we had spent decades under the understanding that the rights guaranteed in the Second Amendment only applied to us within the context of a militia. Come 2008, after years of effort by the National Rifle Association to begin to slowly change that understanding and claim through funding all kinds of history, I put in quotes, and legal research, I also put in quotes, there began to be this view that there's actually within the Second Amendment an individual right to own a firearm. This isn't something, as best we know, that the founding fathers ascribed to, isn't anything that past justices ascribed to. But when a challenge to DC's law prohibiting the possession of a handgun came to the court, all of a sudden, you had a majority opinion that said that indeed, the Supreme Court, the Constitution actually does have that right of having a firearm in your home. And that piece about in your home is really significant, right? Because we're talking about now a new challenge that could expand that definition even further and say, again, for the first time, that now there's a right to have firearms in public spaces, which is, of course, incredibly dangerous. So, to me, this decision, and in the years since, really up until this past year, courts have been fairly deferential to not taking new firearm cases. There's language in the Heller decision that the justice who wrote the majority opinion, the late Scalia, really tried to balance the government's right to regulate public safety and thus regulate firearms with this newfound right. So we saw some changes after Heller. Certainly, laws continued in many states to be loosened, but it wasn't, I don't think, as monumental as we could potentially see out of the court later this year.
Thank you for that, for giving this kind of context. I think that not really understanding even the nuance between like the right to bear arms when it's really about in the context of a militia and how that's changed, right? And what that means. And so, Matt, can you tell us, Igor spoke about this a little bit, he alluded to this. Can you tell us about the case in front of the court now, the New York State Pistol and Rifle Association versus Bruen, and how it fits into the broader attack on gun violence prevention measures?
Yes, absolutely. And I think Igor and Representative Jones laid this out perfectly, because it is impossible to understand this case outside the context of the gun industry's 50-year plot to completely change the meaning of the Constitution, essentially for profit, going against what almost all of this country's history, every court in the United States has recognized, which is the Second Amendment has nothing to do with the government's ability to protect its citizens from gun violence. But the case that is pending in front of the Supreme Court today is the result of the consequence of extremists taking over the National Rifle Association in the 1970s, and as Igor said, funding this scholarship into a essentially made-up version of the Second Amendment, the constitutional gaslighting, really, which started in the public sphere, but then expanded to academia. The NRA awarded $25,000 prizes to academics who fell in line with their constitutional views. Between 1970 and 1989, 70% of law review articles that supported this new version of the Second Amendment were written by academics who had been directly employed by gun rights groups. And of course, all this pays off in the Heller decision, when the conservative majority on the Supreme Court found for the first time in 250 years that the Second Amendment guaranteed the individual right to gun ownership within the home. But the NRA and the gun lobby weren't satisfied with that. And for the past 15 years or so, they've been trying to get the Supreme Court and lower courts to expand the Second Amendment even further, including across two really important dimensions. One, how lower courts should assess the constitutionality of gun laws, and two, expanding the individual right to gun ownership to public spaces, not just within the home. So the case before the court right now, New York State Pistol and Rifle Association versus Bruen, is the accumulation of these 50 years of effort to undo 250 years of legal precedent. Ostensibly, the case is about New York's system of granting licenses to people who want to carry guns in public in a concealed way. New York State is very selective about who they grant concealed carry licenses to. They require applicants to show what they call proper cause for carrying a handgun. And the plaintiff in this case, which is an affiliate of the NRA, is arguing that this high standard for carrying a deadly weapon in public is unconstitutional. As I'm sure we'll talk about later, the nationwide stakes of this case could not be higher. This is not just about New York. this is not just about one kind of law or one law in one state. This case can decide the extent of the Second Amendment in public spaces and how courts all across the country determine whether state and local gun laws are constitutional. The stakes really are enormous for all of our fundamental right to live.
Thank you so much, Matt, for kind of providing some additional context to how we got to this moment. Kind of like this chipping away of what it means to be able to own a gun, and then who gets to own this and attack, and like a systematic attack on our safety in our communities. So Igor, what would be the like immediate on the ground impact of an adverse ruling in this case? Like who would be the most impacted and affected by this decision, and how?
Well, I think, we have to look no further than the New York City subway shooting just a couple of weeks ago, right? This was an incident where an individual obviously caused all kinds of havoc. Mercilessly, nobody was killed in the actions that he took. But imagine if we were in a place where there was this new interpretation of the Second Amendment that said, again, the text of the amendment hasn't changed, right? It's the interpretation that has changed. So we went from firearms are okay in the context of a militia to firearms are okay as an individual right in one's home. And now potentially we could go even further to a place that says firearms are okay in public spaces, right? And so if that happens, a lot of the laws across the country that govern firearms in public spaces could fall. A lot of other gun safety legislation could fall as well. And so if we go back into the New York City subway and we imagine a country where the assailant in that case isn't the only one who has a firearm. Maybe there are other individuals in subway stations who do as well. And then you have a firefight. And then you have, I think, a much higher chance that you would have casualties and injuries, because we know research has shown us, anecdotal stories have shown us that where there are more guns, there are more gun deaths. And by the way, that's true for almost every kind of gun violence that we experience as a country. And just over the last couple of years, in the aftermath of COVID, we've seen how small altercations, arguments that people have in parking lots or in grocery stores turn deadly simply because people have firearms. And the research on this is absolutely definitive, that you're 3 times more likely to commit suicide if you have a firearm in your home. You're 2 times more likely to end up dying in a homicide if a firearm is present. And in terms of how communities and how different communities would be impacted, I mean, we have a history in this country of inequality, of racism, and we've seen from the available data how Black communities and Hispanic communities are disproportionately impacted by gun violence. And those numbers, that disparity will only grow if we have more guns and more armed individuals seeing threats and harms around every corner. So that's the real danger here, is that despite really what science tells us about public safety, the court could move us in the opposite direction, make us less safe, and make communities who are already most vulnerable to gun violence even less safe than that.
Yeah, and it just seems, as you both talk, it seems very clear to me how out of touch the court has been with the everyday lives of American folks or folks in our country, right? So it speaks to the elitism of the bench possibly, and this kind of focus of whose rights and they want to protect the most. So thank you so much for providing that perspective of what this moment could mean. So Matt, March for Our Lives filed an amicus brief in the case, centering the stories specifically of young gun violence survivors across the country. Can you speak to that amicus brief and the voices it represents?
Absolutely. I think, unfortunately, too often our conversations about Second Amendment law, and particularly the conversations that happen about gun regulations in courts, are more focused on legal frameworks or history than the actual lives that are at stake in these cases. March for Our Lives was born from student survivors of gun violence, directly testifying to the pain of gun violence in this country. And our mission for the past several years at March for Our Lives has been to bring those voices, the voices of young survivors of gun violence, into the court where they are not often heard, through storytelling amicus briefs, like the one we filed in this case. And if you look at the brief that we filed in this case, the table of contents is a list of names. We shared the stories of 8 young people from around the country whose lives had been forever devastated by gun violence. Their stories include Samantha Mayers, who was shot in the leg in the Parkland shooting at 16 years old, whose friend died on top of her. Elamar DePaula, who was paralyzed at 19 after a road rage incident turned violent. Victoria Gwynn, who lost her brother to a drive-by shooting, and then in a random shooting a year later, was shot in the leg herself and lost her best friend, who was shot in the head. That is what's at stake in this case. We share these stories in our brief not only to confront the justices who are out of touch with the true devastation of gun violence in America, but to show the way that that devastation is a threat to our core constitutional rights. We're saying the same things we said at the March for Our Lives, March 24th, 2018, but in the language of rights. We have a right to speak out without being shot, to go to school without being shot, to participate in public life without being shot, to live without being shot. And importantly, in all those areas of public life, to not have our exercise of rights chilled by the threat of being shot.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was powerful. You know, when Congressman Jones was talking about Columbine, I was in high school. And to think now that many of the kiddos in my life are the same age that I was when that happened, and the fear that they're living in, and that we are not centering those voices. So thank you so much for that work and for providing that context to the Supreme Court, particularly in this moment. So Igor, your organization advocates for a variety of gun violence prevention measures, many that focus on action in the absence of federal legislation. So in particular, you seek to hold corporate America accountable for its silence in the face of the gun violence epidemic. Can you tell us more about Guns Down America, about some of the policies you endorsed, and about how the ruling in the New York case might affect those priorities?
Yeah, well, look, I certainly think that during, just making sure I'm not on mute, that during periods of stagnation, of an inability to move legislation on the federal level, we may be entering another one of those moments now, if we're not in it already. It's really important for us to activate other powerful voices in society who can make a difference, who can kind of move the ball further down the court. And if you look at how some of the successful movements over the last several decades have made progress, whether it be marriage equality or climate change, and all of the kind of increased education and public understanding of the consequences of those issues, they very smartly energized corporate voices, because I think they ultimately understood that corporate voices, business voices, are able to not only reach audiences that activists can't or politicians can't, but they're able to make different kinds of arguments, right? So you hear businesses talk a lot about the cost of climate change to their businesses, to how they operate, right? And they make this argument that they see a business imperative for action. And we at Guns Down America really believe that the same thing is true when it comes to gun violence, that because businesses, whether they be Walmart, that are directly impacted by gun violence, right, as we saw in the El Paso shooting in 2019, or businesses, for instance, like McDonald's, where in certain areas around the country, particularly in communities with high rates of gun violence, often experience the consequences of that pandemic, right? So what does it mean for their ability to retain customers? What does it mean for their ability to retain employees? Those costs can be monetized, right? And we can make an argument to lawmakers and to the public that there's not just a moral reason to act, because certainly there is, but there's also an economic imperative as well. And so when it comes to the Bruen decision, if we do see an expansion of these rights, I would argue that businesses are actually going to be some of the institutions on the front lines of dealing with this crisis. If you see folks coming into a growing number of customers or employees coming into their establishments with firearms, and again, those small arguments escalating into something larger. So I would argue they have a real role to play in dealing with the potential fallout of a poor Supreme Court decision, but also I think they should be publicly arguing to the court today as it writes that opinion, that there are other real factors to consider, and one of them I think are the business costs of gun violence and increased gun violence.
Yeah, thank you for that. In America, there's literally a cost for everything, and to be able to talk to business and understand that there's a loss if you don't act, right? And so how do we make them see that this is important? So thank you for that work. So Matt, could you tell us more about your work at March for Our Lives and about how that work might be impacted by the New York case?
Absolutely. March for Our Lives is a movement of people.
Matt, if you can hear us, your internet's kind of is breaking up on us.
Sorry about that.
That's all good.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're good.
The NRA is doing, I'm sure. But March for Our Lives has a policy agenda across urgently needed reforms, holding the gun lobby accountable, investing in safety, raising the standards of gun ownership, building a real democracy, leveraging the executive power of the presidency to stop violence. And I don't think it would be an exaggeration at all to say that every single gun violence prevention policy that we support and are working to implement is threatened by the Supreme Court's decision in this case. There's a few different ways the case could go. The Supreme Court could rule narrowly and just address the question of concealed carry licensing systems. They might say that New York's standard of requiring cause to get a concealed carry permit violates the Second Amendment, and the Supreme Court could just strike down that kind of law everywhere it exists. 80 million Americans currently live in a state with those kind of similar concealed carry requirements. So if the Supreme Court rules that way, quite a few more Americans will be forced to live in a country where, as Igor was saying, people in grocery stores, the movie theater, and public transit are carrying guns. But the Supreme Court could also go in a far more broad and dangerous direction in this case and dictate an entirely new process for deciding whether a state gun regulation is constitutional. Right now, courts use a two-step approach to decide whether a regulation burdens the Second Amendment and whether it serves a compelling governmental interest, as in save lives. Gun right extremists, including Brett Kavanaugh when he was on the DC Circuit Court, have advocated for a completely different and artificial test called text, history, and tradition, where any new gun law has to have a historical analog in order to be constitutional. If the court goes this way, pretty much all existing and future gun laws are at risk. That kind of test, that kind of process would amount to a completely artificial blood-soaked ceiling on gun violence prevention in this country.
It's really interesting to hear how Republicans have played the mental gymnastics to get what they want at the cost of us. So thank you for that. Igor, Matt had talked about this a little bit, about the role that the NRA has played in rigging gun violence prevention laws. Could you talk to us a little bit more about the role the NRA has played in rigging our Supreme Court?
Yeah, well, I think the NRA, truly understood the power of organizing a very vocal and dedicated constituency, be it the folks who are vocal relatively small, and pushing them to elect certainly members of Congress, folks on the state level, but of course presidents, and ensuring that certainly conservative Republican presidents really saw the value of courting so-called Second Amendment voters, and organized it as a real, true Republican constituency that's part of the Republican coalition. So through really a series of endorsements, starting first, well, the first one was Ronald Reagan, but really in 2000 when they endorsed President George W. Bush, and did so with the understanding that the court, was an important factor. George W. Bush, of course, nominated Justices Alito and Roberts, both of whom are on the majority opinion of Heller. The court the NRA played a significant role in ensuring that Merrick Garland wouldn't get a hearing in the final year of Obama's term, and actively engaged in first endorsing Trump in 2016, one of the first issue area groups to do so, and they did that much earlier than they had in the past, and much earlier than other right-wing special interest groups. And of course, President Trump gave us Justices Barrett, Kavanaugh, and Gorsuch, all of whom are, of course, expected we don't know which side they'll end up, but are expected to support a more expansive understanding of the Second Amendment. So, Matt noted the changes that happened in the NRA in the late 1960s and 70s. Though the folks who really took over understood the power of that kind of political organizing. I think you could really draw a straight line between the real kind of political awakening that the organization had, and to, I think, what they would certainly view as a success today, which is an incredibly stacked court that believes in gun rights that are just far more expansive than regular Americans would like to see.
Yes, thank you for that. It's good things aren't a coincidence, right? And I think that we need to be reminded that there are powerful parties at play, but that's also why we are here, because we need to organize just as much as they are. So thank you for that additional context. Matt, I'm going to kind of pull together a couple of questions. So someone in our chat asked about a case. Let me find it. DC Circuit's 2017 decision in Wren versus DC. Not sure if you're familiar with it, but kind of talking about this context about the lower courts. I think we talk a lot about the Supreme Court, but cases don't get to the Supreme Court mostly until they come to the lower courts. So could you talk to us about kind of any cases that are moving through the lower courts, and then what can we see in terms of what will mean, for the Supreme Court case that we have right now?
Yeah, a lot hangs on what this court decides. There are a lot of cases concerning new aspects of gun regulations that are put on pause right now, waiting for what the Supreme Court decides in this case, because it could be so sweeping and so devastating. We're involved in a case in Michigan fighting to keep guns off of college campuses, both at University of Michigan and across the state. And that case has also just been put on pause while we wait for the Supreme Court to decide whether they are going to devastate the gun violence prevention status quo in this country. Essentially, all of us, including the judicial system, are waiting to see whether the Supreme Court respects our voices and the will of the legislative process, or puts more of us at risk. After this case, whatever the court decides, March for Our Lives is going to fight back. There is going to be a wave of litigation questioning every established part of the Second Amendment paradigm as it stands right now, every part of the public safety infrastructure that voters have built over the past 250 years in this country. How devastating that wave of litigation ends up being depends on how broad the Supreme Court chooses to rule in this case, and how willing it demonstrates it is to disregard what Americans have done through the political process in this country.
Oh, thank you. It's all connected. These it's one thing after another. So it's good to know, though, like I said, that we're organizing and that we have a plan, right, to see what we need to do to continue to win this. There's a couple of questions in the chat that I wanted us to kind of talk about before I go into the next piece about expansion, or what kind of really what we can do to really put a stop to the Supreme Court's attack on our ability to protect ourselves and our communities. But I think a lot of the conversation in the chat has been about why are guns so popular in our country right now? And then how is that compared to other countries where we don't see the same number of gun violence or deaths as you find here in the United States? So either Matt or Igor.
Well, it's a difficult question to answer about why guns are so popular. I certainly think that going back to really the days of Manifest Destiny, and this notion of American expansion and American masculinity, that there's something that was woven into the romanticism of the American story that was attached to the firearm. And early American firearm manufacturers really exploited those myths actively and deliberately to sell more guns. And we see that in the industry advertising to this very day. And so part of it, I think there's just something in America's history, the fact that the first colonists came over and used firearms to subjugate Native Americans. Later, those firearms were used to subjugate African slaves. Something just deep in American history of growth that involves the firearm that I think is different from other countries. And then people talk a lot about the role of popular media and whether this violent popular media is any kind of factor. That to me is a hard sell, particularly if you look at American movies and music videos and what else all around the world. It's only the United States that has this kind of problem. The good news is, if we are maybe to find a glimmer of it, is that, if you asked Americans 40, 50 years ago if they thought firearms made them safer, they would say they didn't. You would ask the same question now, and they would agree, right? Many of them over the last couple of years rushed out and purchased firearms in these panic buying hysteria during the COVID-19 pandemic. So something shifted, right? And I think partly what shifted is that the industry and the lobby just got a whole lot better at selling firearms. You also had the Second Iraq War that glorified firearms and glorified war. And in fact, a lot of the industry then followed suit and began marketing firearms in these very militaristic, warlike ways. So, I would point to some of those factors. But I also suspect that, there's that you could tell all kinds of different stories about why we're a country that has more guns than people.
No, thank you for that. I think it's important to talk about how we get here in a lot of different ways, and part of our culture as well. So in our last few minutes, I want to talk about the Supreme Court and court expansion and what this case means to this work for court expansion and also your work as an organization. So as we talked at the top of the hour, a year ago, legislation was introduced in both the House and the Senate that would expand the Supreme Court by 4 seats. Your organizations joined a number of other gun violence prevention organizations in endorsing that legislation immediately after the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in the New York case. Igor, how did your organization come to the conclusion that court expansion should be a part of your advocacy work?
Well, look, I think we understood that we now live in a country where the will of Americans, when it comes to an overwhelming majority telling us they want background checks, that they want to ban assault weapons and high capacity magazines, true for both the general population and gun owners, when that opinion is simply not reflected in the current setup of the court, the current membership of the court. And the fact that that particular configuration came to us through, as we've been discussing tonight, just a high degree of political manipulation and sabotage, to say the least. There was simply no choice that if we are to prioritize saving lives, if we are to prioritize people's well-being, community safety, that expanding the court, given where we find ourselves today, is an absolute no-brainer, especially because, as we know and as we've been discussing, Republicans have spent decades packing the courts with these ideologues who don't actually represent what Americans want to see on this issue or on many others.
Yeah, thank you. I like this piece about, like, it felt very clear, right? So it's a power analysis where we look at the numbers, we look at the people, our base, and they're saying this, and overwhelming, even people not in our base are saying this, but this body is doing something different out of whack with what we want. So we need to shift that power. Matt, same for you all at March for Our Lives. Why was court expansion the right decision in that moment? And what does this mean for your work?
Yeah, what you've seen over the past decade, certainly what we've seen, is the gun lobby trying to use the Supreme Court to go around the democratic process. They also have identified the Supreme Court as an institution that is willing to overrule the will of the American people and essentially legislate, create a world unilaterally where no one votes, where the right to fire a gun is valued higher than our right to live. And they can only do that because the Supreme Court has become so politicized, so stacked, and seems so comfortable flexing its power, whether in the context of guns, abortion, workers' rights, or any issue before the court. It is imperative that we restore balance to the Supreme Court. At March for Lives, we believe in ending lifetime appointments, in mandating actual ethics rules, in requiring supermajorities to invalidate laws. And as the Judiciary Act seeks to do, add additional seats to the Supreme Court in line with what Congress has done throughout American history to keep our country's growing population, to keep up with our country's growing population, and the increased number of circuit courts in our country. It matters not just for gun violence prevention, not just for the court's deference to the will of the American people, but to the legitimacy of the Supreme Court as an institution and whether we truly live in a democracy or not.
Absolutely. I know that this is happening a little bit in the chat, but when we talk about court expansion, adding 4 seats, I feel like the most natural response is, well, what will Republicans do? And I remind people that they've already changed the number of seats to the Supreme Court when they denied President Obama his appointment, and that they've already done enough to rig the courts against us, and that this is no longer, we're tired of playing political tit for tat. We need to actually rebalance our courts, and this is the most progressive and best way to do it. And like I think Matt just said, it's not the first time that seats have been added to the Supreme Court. It doesn't take a constitutional amendment. It's not the will of the Congress, which is really the will of the people. And we're seeing more and more that the people are seeing how out of step the Supreme Court is with everyday folks. They have the lowest approval rating that they've ever had since we started recording approval ratings of the Supreme Court. And so we know that with the coming term and the decisions that are happening, we don't think that their approval rating will get much higher. So these are the kind of steps that we need to take. So Matt and Igor, thank you so much again for joining us this evening and just really shedding some really important light on this important case that we're waiting to hear a decision from, and also the advocacy work that you all are leading, and why also court expansion feels like the most logical step in the fight to creating a real comprehensive gun violence prevention for our communities and our country. So thank you both again, and thank you for everyone who joined us this evening in the chat and at home or wherever you're calling from and listening into. Hope you learned something, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.